Today's stuff is Daf Tes, and we already had quoted Rav, so we're going to quote Rav in a different context, and you'll see this on the second line. V'yomer Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rav Talmid Chacham tzarich sheyilmod shlosha dvarim. A Talmid Chacham has to realize that he may find himself in a locale where there's no one else to service the community, and therefore he should learn Ksav, Shchita, Umila. These are the three things. Now, as far as Ksav is concerned, there are many different shitos in what the word Ksav means. Rashi goes with the approach that he has to make sure that he has a certain distinct signature because he's going to be in charge of signing with two other judges, or he might be, in a court decision. So he has to have a very distinguished signature. And also, if, let's say, he has to testify and he has to sign as a witness. Others say that Ksav has to do with writing a Sefer Torah, that he might get stuck in a place where there's no Sefer Torah or Megillah or one of the Sfarim. So he should learn that Ksav. Shchita, of course, because he might find himself in a locale where there's no one to shecht. And the same thing as far as Mila is concerned. So again, these are not usual kinds of things that necessarily come up all the time. And therefore, on an occasion where they come up, if there's no shochet or mohel, we have to find someone. So the Talmid Chacham should be the one to step up to the plate. Rav Chananya bar Shamim Sheish de Rav, another statement in the name of Rav, but a slightly different presentation about what a Talmid Chacham has to be an expert in. Af kesher shel tefillin, meaning there are laws about how you tie the kesher of the tefillin, and that is the letter dalid on the back of his head. And you've got to put the ritzuos together and create a dalid, and then on the tefillin shel yad you have to have a yud. So that's another kind of knot. And then if we're talking about the bottom of tefillin, then you have to keep in mind that with regard to the bias of the shell rosh, there's halacha Moshe Sinai that requires a letter shin with four legs, if you want to call it that. And there's a whole to do about how you create that letter. But in any event, you have the shin, then you have the dalid, and you have the yud, and that spells Hashem's name. So a scholar has to learn how to tie the straps, the ritzuos, to create these ksharim. It's interesting, there's a machlokas between Rabbeinu Tam and trying to remember the name of the other Baal HaTosfos, very rarely quoted Baal HaTosfos, maybe it'll come to me. But anyway, they argue about whether or not ukshartem, with regard to tefillin, obligates you to create a kesher every single day, which would mean that every day you take apart the kesher shel tefillin and then you put it back together. Rabbeinu Tam rejects that opinion. And the reason for that is because the Gemara seems to assume that a kesher shel tefillin is a malacha doraisa, and if it's something that you have to take apart on a daily basis, it would not qualify as a malacha doraisa. Now we have Birchas Chasanim, which are 7 brachos, many of which are very complex brachos, and they're recited under the chuppah and also for the Shivas Yimei HaMishta, and the Talmid Chacham should know these brachos. And also, when you talk about tzitzis, right, you have to know exactly how to tie the knots, which are called the krichos of the tzitzis. And he says here that the tzitzis are tied in a series of knots and windings. and the remaining length of the tzitzis are hanging down. So Rav says that a Talmud Chacham has to learn how tzitzis should be tied. Be'idoch. Now, what about the original quote of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav? He only had three. Why didn't he go beyond and increase the list with Keshel Tefillin and with Birchas Chsanim and Tzitzis? And the Gemara answers, Hani Shchichin. In other words, you really don't need the expertise of a Talmud Chacham because these are very common and almost anyone would know how to fix the Keshel Tefillin. And I would add the following, that even in terms of Shechita and Mila and Ksav, in our day that we have those who are experts at that, maybe we can alleviate the Talmud Chacham, again, unless he's going out to Yehupitz, Omer Rav Yehuda Meshmuel, Kol Tabach She'eni Yodei Shechita. If you have a shochet who is expert at shechita, but he doesn't know the laws of shechita, even if he's done shechita in the past and we watched him and he did a perfect job, also lechol mishchitos, he can't eat from his slaughtered meat because he doesn't know the laws of shechita. And although he may have gotten it right on a few occasions, which might be coincidental, but unless you know the laws of shechita, the five psulei shechita is very complicated. You have to know about them. He may not even know about them because he doesn't know the laws of shechita. There's shehiyah, there's drasa, there's chaloda, there's agrama, ve'ikur. Again, all these different categories, we'll learn about them. Let's just say a word about shehiyah, like in the middle of the shechita between, let's say, this first siman and the second siman, he takes a pause, he gets a phone call, you know what I mean? So he doesn't realize that there's any problem with that. He shechted one siman, he's going to come back after the phone call and shech the other siman. But in truth, unbeknown to him, the shechita is psula. Michael Mashma, now Shmuel is really reiterating what we know from the Mishnah. Actually, the Mishnah is divided up into different parts. But Kula Taninu, at the end of the day, all five psulei shechita are recorded in the Mishnah. So obviously, if he doesn't know those five psulei shechita that are recorded in the Mishnah, we cannot rely on his shechita. Lo tzricha sheshachat lefanenu shtayim o sholosh piyamim. He has a very good track record. We watched him do shechita twice or thrice. V'shachat shapir, and he did a great job. I might think me to eat shachat shapir from the fact that on these occasions, almost like a chazaka, 3 times over, he was able to slaughter the animal properly as high nami shachat shapir. So now when he went ahead and he shechted, and there was no one there to watch him, we can eat from his meat and assume that he did a good shechita like he did in the past. He's got a great track record. Komash Malon came into Lo Gomar, since he didn't know the laws of shechita, zimnin deshoy vidoris, below yada. Right, so there's something called a psul of drasa. Drasa means like he pushes the knife into the simonim without slicing them. He may not even realize that he implemented a psul shchita. So therefore, anyone who's not a baki and does not know the laws of shchita cannot shech. Again, if there was supervision and people watched him and he did a great job, but unless we observe him carefully, then it's not a good shechita. My father, may rest in peace, was a rav in a city, a little town in Maine, not just a small town, but a small Jewish community called Bangor, Maine. And my father was all of 22 years old when he took that position. He had just gotten smicha. Actually, he didn't get officially smicha because there was one bechina he hadn't taken. That's a story unto itself. But why do I mention my father's rabbanis in Bangor? Because my father discovered in Bangor, Maine, that there were 2 shochtim that did not know the laws of shechita. He tested them and they didn't know. And he tried to drive them out, but at the end he lost the battle. And after trying to battle 2 years against because a lot of the meat was coming from Bangor, Maine throughout the United States at that time, kosher meat. So on Yom Kippur night, after 2 years plus as the Rav of Bangor, Maine, my father got up on cold Nidra night and he said either they leave Bangor, Maine or I leave Bangor, Maine. And my father had to leave Bangor, Maine. Anyway, B'yomer Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel hatabach tzarich sheyivdok b'simonim liachar shchita. So Shmuel establishes a requirement that it's not enough to do a shchita and assume that you did a great job. You have to check the kana and the veshet to make sure the kana is called the esophagus, the veshet is called the trachea, and to make sure that they were cut properly, which means that you need rov shnei simonim. Each one of the simonim requires rov, and maybe he's going to look and see that he left behind more than half of the simon. Amar Rav Yosef, Afanan Nami Tnina. We have this in a Mishnah, and Rabbi Shimon Omer Im Shaha Kedei Bikur. Okay, now exactly how long of a shehir is, as we said in the middle of the shechita, he got a phone call. How long did he delay and interrupt his shechita? So that's going to be this mini sugya that we have now, not the main sugya for today, and it's Kedei Bikur. Now, the literal translation of Kedei Bikur will offer, but what's more important is that obviously it must be famous and well known exactly how long Kedei Bikur is. Because otherwise, how do you know what is the shear of Zman of Shehiyah, how long he took a pause and interrupted his Shechita? It must be that Kedei Bikur is something that's well known. And therefore, says Rav Yosef, if Kedei Bikur is well known, it must be based on or reflective of the ruling of Shmuel that after the Shechita you have to do a Bikur. Amalei Abai says, no, I don't believe that you have proven Shmuel. Because Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Kedei Bikur Chacham. The Kedei Bikur here, which is commonly known, is the amount of time it takes when you bring a Talmud Chacham to check the knife to make sure that the knife has no nicks on it. So the Talmud Chacham will use his nail and he'll go up and down the knife until he gets stuck in a nick, and then he'll passel the shechita. So the Mishnah itself speaks about Kedei Bikur Chacham, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, there's no discussion here about Bikur Simonim. So there's no proof to adduce in favor of Shmuel, who says that after every shechita you have to do a Bikur Simonim to make sure that the row of Shnaim was slaughtered. Gemara says in Cain, I don't understand Rabbi Yochanan's take on this. What do you mean Kedei Bikur Chacham? How long will it take to invite the Chacham in order to come and check the knife of the Shochet? And if the Chacham is on the other side of town, it could take an hour or 2 hours. If he's here locally, it could take 5 minutes. We have a rule that when you talk about a shear, in this case the shear of Zman, it's got to be standard. It can't change from time to time. That's not the way shiurim work. Ella, says the Gemara, let's reiterate Rabbi Yochanan and reinterpret it. Kedei Bikur Tabach Chacham. Meaning that the Shochet in this situation is himself a Talmud Chacham. And therefore, he doesn't have to come from any distance. He's afinard. He's there. He shechted the animal. Now he's going to check to make sure that everything was shechted properly, and that there are no nicks on the knife. And that's already a standard amount of time, because any chacham would take X number of seconds to check the knife. There's no additional element here of transportation. We're talking about the butcher himself is the chacham, and immediately after he shechs, he can determine whether the knife had any nicks on it. Now the Gemara wants to know lo barak mai. once Shmuel has established that every butcher after he shechs requires bedika to check the simonim, what happens in the event that he flew the coop? He's nowhere to be found. We have the meat of the animal. Can we eat it? Or should we say no? Lo badak, then b'di'evet, it's not a valid shechita. So again, Rabosa, we're not talking about a case where we have doubts as to whether or not the shochet knows the halachos, or doubts as to whether or not the shochet is a skilled slaughterer. That we have. But what we don't have is Shmuel's bedika, which comes after the shechita, to check the simonim to guarantee that the simonim were cut properly. So the Gemara quotes Rabbi Lazar, the name of another Rabbi Lazar. Okay, fine. Treifa v'asura ba'achila. Okay, this is what I call classic brisk. In brisk they talk about tzvei dinim, two concepts. Shechita accomplishes two different things, and there's a nafkamina, fundamental difference between them. On the one hand, shechita is matir the basar, because up until the point of shechita, it's ever menachai. And number two, shechita is metayr midei nevela, which means the following. If an animal drops dead without shechita, the carcass is called nevela, and if you carry it, then you become tameh. That's called tumas nevela. In fact, in the case of an oaf, a bird who dies, it's also metame in the base hablia, meaning if you didn't come in contact with the dead carcass of the bird, but somebody put it into your mouth, you contract tumah. So that's called tumas nevela. Then there's something called treifa. In the case of treifa, although the shechita could not be a matir because the basar of a treifa is asur, but yet the shechita is a metaher. The shechita of a treifa will be metaher midei nevela. It'll remove the status of nevela. It's not a gepegit, or it's not an animal that dropped dead, but rather it's an animal that was slaughtered. Again, the slaughter, insofar as its goal is to be matir the basar, is irrelevant because we're talking about a treifa. The animal has, a puncture in its lungs, so it's not going to survive. But the shechita is meaningful to remove nevela. Now, for some odd reason, according to this tradition of Rabbi Lazar, it's treifa, but that means it's not tameh. The Masnisaton, on the other hand, in a brisa, it says just the opposite, nevela mitame b'masa. So the Gemara asks, "My komifli, what are they arguing about?" And basically, I think the Gemara's question, or shall I say, what irritates the Gemara, is Rabbi Lazar, as in the name of Rabbi Lazar, because how can you differentiate between nevela and treifa and say that, in other words, if you're not validating the shechita because lo badak, then what you have is an nevela. For all intents and purposes, an animal that dropped dead. So how can you tell me it's not mitame? And nevela is mitame. And the Gemara answers it all revolves around Rav Huna. But Rav Huna, the Omar, what was Rav Huna's statement? So just by way of introduction, what Rav Huna is going to address is the issue of chazaka. Chazaka means if we have a status quo, then the burden of proof is on you, whoever you is, to disprove and uproot the status quo. So that's called chazaka. So Rav Huna made the following statement: Behema b'chayeh b'cheskas Yisrael medes. So what's the chazaka status, the status quo status of a live animal? It is b'cheskas Yisrael. Why? Because it's ever menachai. You can't eat the live animal. Ad she'ivada l'cha b'men nishchita. In other words, now the burden of proof is to remove the chazaka, to be matir the basar, by proving and establishing that there was a proper shechita. But nishchita, if there was a shechita, And maybe we have doubts about the validity of the shechita, but nevertheless, it does remove the cheskas isur of behema b'chayeh b'cheskas isur omeres and substitutes instead a cheskas heter. Meaning now, if you want to come along and undermine that shechita and invalidate it by establishing that there was a psul, then the burden of proof is on you now to undermine the chazak of heter that was generated by the shechita. And therefore, harei b'cheskes heter ad sheyivadol l'chaba me'mitzvah. Now, in the case of treifa, it's very, very tricky. Because very often, after the shechita, we lo and behold find out, and we discover that there was a hole in one of the internal organs of this animal. But the question is, if let's say shechita was time T1, and then there was time T2, let's say in the meantime an animal came along and grabbed the meat and so forth and so on. Then there's time T3 when we check the animal and we realize that something's missing. There's an organ that's not there. So the animal technically would be a treifa, except that it could be that irua, that happening that made it into a treifa, like when it was pounced on by an animal, that may have taken place after the shechita. If it takes place after the shechita is perfectly good. The fact that an animal, started eating the meat, that's irrelevant. So basically, Rav Huna is saying that once there's a shechita, if you have a suffix that maybe the animal is a treifa, we're going to assume a cheskas kshera, until we know otherwise, we're not going to assume it was treifa at the time of the shechita. And Mar Sovar, now we can understand the chumrah of the brisa that b'cheskas isur kaima, that since the animal during its lifetime had a cheskas isur, and therefore Rav Huna says that to remove that cheskas isur you need to know about a shechita. V'hashta meisahi. Now the animal's dead. We don't know if there was a proper shechita, and therefore the animal is an avela. And if it's an avela, it's metame. Mar Sava, but Rabbi Lazar, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, says b'cheskas isur amrina and b'cheskas tumala amrina. And differentiating between these tzvei dinim of isur and treifa, what Rabbi Lazar is arguing is that although it's true that the animal during its lifetime, as Rav Huna points out, is b'cheskas isur because behema b'chayeh it's evrim and achai, but as far as tumah and tar is concerned, the animal does not convey tumah. So the animal in its lifetime, vis-a-vis the laws of tumah and any suffix tumah that might arise, has a chazaka of not being tmeah. Now you want to say, well, guess what? The shechita wasn't a proper shechita, and the animal's in a vela, drops dead without shechita. The burden of proof is on you if you want to establish its tumah status. As far as the Isur is concerned, even Rabbi Lazar concedes that and therefore, until you know for sure there was a proper shechita, you can't eat the meat. But as far as tumah v'tara is concerned, the animal in its lifetime has a cheskas tara, and now the burden of proof is on you to prove that it was tmeah, which means that it was already a treifa at the time of the shechita. Gufa Amar Rav Huna behema chaya b'cheskas isur omeres had shiva l'chav nishkata nishkata b'cheskas heter omeres had shiva l'chav amen nitrafa. So the Gemara asks the following: What does Rav Huna mean when he says that ad sheyivada l'chav amen nitrafa v'lema nishkata hutra? Why does he use the terminology? The Gemara is being very meticulous about the choice of words of Rav Huna, and he says, Becheskas heter omedes. Forget about Becheskas heter. He should have said hutra. I don't need to introduce chazakas here. The animal is mutter. Why? Because there was a shechita. So the Gemara answers, Hakamash Malon, this Yalid Bar Reusa. Even in a case where you have a Reusa, whenever you have a chazaka, then you could possibly have a reusa. Let me see if I can give an example. Yeah, let's say, for example, a man is tamei and he jumps into a mikveh, and then afterwards, when he comes out of the mikveh, we find some sort of a bug on his body, or I don't know, some sort of blotch. So the question, so that's a chatzitza, but we don't know if that bug fell on his body after he came out of the mikveh or before he went into the mikveh. So that finding the blotch or whatever it is, and it's a chatzitza, that is a reus on the original Maaseh Tefillah. Or for the Gemara has in Ksubis a reisa in the case of a woman who's becheskas pesula, she never had relations, and then he finds a pesach pasuach, and that's a reisa on hacheskas pesulin, so forth and so on. Here we have a reisa. What's the reisa? Kideboy minei Rab Abba meirav Huna. So Rab Abba raised the question, what was the reisa? Ba ze'ev v'notol b'nei me'ayim mahu. So now we're talking about a case where if you translate the Gemara literally, we'll see how the Gemara reinterprets it. But right now, a an animal was slaughtered, and now a wolf attacks the dead body of the animal after shechita. And natal, natal means it takes away the small intestines of the animal. They're gone. You know, the zev is, I don't know where he is. So now the question is, maybe those intestines had a hole in them and the animal was a treifa. So Gemara says, I don't get it. Natal, holesnahu. Why should we suspect that the animal is a treifa? Just because we can't find the intestines, that doesn't mean it was a treifa. There's no proof whatsoever, or even a razor, to indicate that there was a hole in the internal intestines. Ella, but rather let's reformulate Rabbi Abba's question. He says, "Nokav b'nei me'ayim ma." What happens is we have the intestines, but the wolf attacked the intestines and punctured them, right? Maybe bit into them. And now, perhaps exactly at that spot, there was a trephus, meaning some sort of internal injury. So once again, the Gemara says, wait a second, Nokav. You're telling me that the wolf attacked the intestines of the slaughtered animal and punctured them. Why should you think that there's a nekev that was naturally in the animal's body at the time of the shechita making the treifa when it's the penetration of the wolf, which is post shechita, that penetrated and created that hole? Ella, again, we have to reformulate Rabbi Abba's question. Nitolan v'chziron shem nekuvim mal. The wolf ran away with the intestines and then returned them. Again, I don't know why the wolf is being so magnanimous about, but he returned them. And guess what? What we find now is that the intestines are punctured. Nekev, Nokav, Olo. Should we assume that before the Shechita there was already some sort of a hole in the intestines? Or should we say no? It was the wolf's teeth when he bit the intestines posthumously. That's what created the hole. Amalei, so if Huna responds, so we have no reason to assume that in addition to the hole that was created by the teeth of the wolf, there was another hole in the animal in its natural state that, or unnatural state that made it into a treifa before the shechita. Okay, now, just 1 second. What are we? Oh, okay. Now we have to sort of shift a little bit of our focus, because the Gemara now is going to quote a brisa that deals with sakana. And you may recall there's a principle in halachas chamira sakanta bisura. We're even more machmir in sakana, in danger and hazards to health, than we are with isurim. And that's going to be Abaye's shita here on Daf Tesam and Beis. So what happened in this price? So rot sipra hamenaker b'te'ena, right? So the bird is pecking at a fig, or alternatively, akbar hamenaker b'avtachayim, avatichim. So we have now a mouse that is pecking at a watermelon. Now, again, in the case of pecking, we're going to have to worry about snakes, believe it or not.